The morning after March 24th, 1943. 0700 hours. Forward observation post, El Guettar, Tunisia. Captain Robert Morrison of the 1st Infantry Division's intelligence staff stood among the wreckage scattered across the valley floor, his field notebook trembling slightly in his hands. Before him lay the burned-out hulks of 30 German tanks, some still smoldering, their thick armor plates torn open like tin cans. The acrid smell of burning fuel and cordite hung thick in the morning air. He had come forward at dawn to assess the previous day's action, expecting to document a fighting withdrawal, perhaps a costly defensive success. Instead, he found this. "This can't be real," Morrison muttered, counting the destroyed vehicles again. 30 Panzers, 30 of Germany's finest tanks, stopped cold in less than 4 hours of fighting by troops who had been routed at Kasserine Pass barely a month earlier. The same Americans whom every Allied officer privately called inexperienced, untested, unreliable. The same division that German intelligence had assessed as third-rate. Morrison knelt beside a Panzer Mark IV, running his hand along a massive hole punched through its frontal armor. The penetration was clean, precise, exactly what an American 75mm anti-tank gun would produce at optimal range. What Captain Morrison didn't know, as he traced that fatal wound with his fingers, was that he was documenting the first clear evidence of a transformation that would reshape Allied calculations about American military capability and ultimately alter the strategic balance of the entire Mediterranean campaign. The mathematics were staggering. The German 10th Panzer Division had attacked with 50 tanks at 0600 hours on March 23rd. By 0900 hours, 30 of those tanks were destroyed or disabled. A 60% loss rate in 3 hours. Morrison's calculations showed that American artillery alone had fired over 3,000 rounds during those 3 hours. A rate of expenditure that suggested not panic, but coordinated, controlled defensive fire. The anti-tank guns, a mix of 37mm and the new 75mm pieces, had achieved a hit rate that Morrison initially thought must be a recording error. According to the gun crew's reports, they had fired approximately 240 rounds and achieved at least 30 confirmed kills or mission kills. Even accounting for multiple guns firing at single targets, the effectiveness ratio was unprecedented for American forces. The force ratios told an even more remarkable story. The German attack had been supported by artillery, infantry, and armored half-tracks, and had achieved complete surprise, overrunning the American front line in the first 15 minutes. By every doctrine, every lesson learned from North African fighting to date, this should have resulted in an American collapse. The Germans had concentrated superior force at the decisive point. They had tactical surprise. They had vastly more combat experience. The mathematics of conventional military analysis predicted a German breakthrough. Instead, the mathematics of the battlefield had produced a German bloodbath. American forces at El Guettar faced an enemy with 10 times their combat experience, yet inflicted losses at a 3-to-1 ratio in armor, and forced a German withdrawal twice in a single day. The statistical reality was even more striking when Morrison began comparing ammunition expenditure. The 1st Infantry Division's artillery battalions had arrived in Tunisia with what was considered adequate stocks, enough for several days of intense fighting based on European experience. In 3 hours on March 23rd, they had expended nearly 15% of their total ammunition supply. Yet rather than indicating waste or panic, the expenditure records showed precisely the opposite. Every battery had maintained reporting discipline. Fire missions were logged with target coordinates, rounds fired, and observed effects. The pattern suggested not desperation, but doctrine being executed under pressure. Morrison pulled out a creased intelligence summary from his pack, one he had read so many times he had nearly memorized it. Dated February 26th, barely 4 weeks earlier, it contained the German assessment of American forces captured at Kasserine Pass. The Americans, it read, show poor tactical coordination, inadequate artillery support, and a tendency to abandon positions under determined attack. Their junior officers lack initiative, and their troops lack the mental toughness required for modern warfare. That assessment had seemed uncomfortably accurate to every American officer who had survived Kasserine. Morrison himself had written similar observations in his own reports. Now he stood in a field of destroyed German tanks that told a completely different story. The world Morrison had known 3 weeks earlier, the world of American military inexperience and inferiority, was built on what had seemed like irrefutable evidence. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had arrived in North Africa in early November 1942 as part of Operation Torch. They were considered one of America's better divisions. But that wasn't saying much. The division's officers were mostly products of rapid wartime expansion. Its enlisted ranks mixed a corps of pre-war regulars with draftees who had been in uniform less than 2 years. Most had never heard shots fired in anger before landing in Africa. Morrison himself typified the new American officer corps. 32 years old, he had graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1933 with a degree in history, taught high school for 6 years, and received his commission through Officer Candidate School in 1941. He had exactly 18 months of military experience, all stateside, when he landed at Oran. His knowledge of war came from books, training exercises, and the hard lessons of the past 4 months in Tunisia. Those lessons had been brutal. The American II Corps, which included the 1st Infantry Division, had been mauled at Kasserine Pass in mid-February. German armor had torn through American positions, sending inexperienced troops fleeing in disorder. Morrison had spent 3 days helping reorganize stragglers, watching demoralized men trickle back in small groups, many without weapons or equipment. The defeat had confirmed what many suspected. American troops were not ready to face veteran German forces in open battle. The British, with 3 years of desert warfare experience, had been diplomatically skeptical about American capabilities. British liaison officers attached to American units filed reports that praised American equipment and logistics, but questioned tactical competence. Morrison had read several of these reports. They were professionally worded, but the message was clear. The Americans needed more time, more training, more experience before they could be trusted in a primary combat role. Even American commanders shared these doubts. Major General George Patton had taken command of II Corps after Kasserine specifically to restore discipline and fighting spirit. His first orders emphasized basics: proper uniform, saluting, military courtesy. The implication was that American failures stemmed from lack of military bearing and discipline. If soldiers would salute properly and maintain standards, Patton suggested, they would fight better. It was a theory that made sense to everyone. It was also completely inadequate to explain what Morrison now observed in the valley before El Guetar. The assault on Gafsa and El Guetar had been planned as a limited offensive, a chance for American troops to gain confidence against weaker Italian forces before facing Germans again. On March 17th, the 1st Infantry Division had taken Gafsa with minimal resistance. Italian defenders had withdrawn quickly, exactly as expected. The town was important as a road junction, but the operation was designed more for morale than strategic impact. On March 18th, the 1st Ranger Battalion moved to El Guetar, an oasis town 20 miles east. Again, Italian forces withdrew with only token resistance, though they established defensive positions on the hills overlooking the town and blocked the mountain pass to the south. The plan called for American forces to secure El Guetar, build up supplies, and gradually push eastward. It was a cautious plan, appropriate for troops still recovering from the shock of Kasserine. No one expected the Germans to counterattack. German forces were heavily engaged further north against British forces, and El Guetar seemed like a secondary front. American intelligence estimated that if the Germans reacted at all, it would be with a spoiling attack by a single battalion, easily repulsed by prepared defenses. At 0600 hours on March 23rd, German General Jürgen von Arnim had launched not a spoiling attack, but a full division-scale assault. The 10th Panzer Division was one of Germany's elite armored formations, veterans of the French campaign and 2 years of desert warfare. Their attack followed German tactical doctrine perfectly. Artillery preparation, rapid tank advance, infantry following in half tracks to consolidate gains. The 50 tanks represented roughly half the division's armor strength, supported by mobile artillery and at least 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers. The German plan was sound. Intelligence indicated American forces were still moving into position around El Guetar. The Americans would be partially deployed, supplies would be limited, coordination would be imperfect. A sharp blow would drive them back, perhaps rout them entirely as at Kasserine. Even if the attack failed to break through completely, it would disrupt American offensive preparations and buy time for Axis forces to consolidate their defensive line. Morrison had reconstructed the German plan from captured documents and interrogation reports. It was exactly the kind of attack that should have worked. At Kasserine, a similar German assault had shattered American positions. The psychological impact had been devastating. Officers who survived Kasserine still flinched at the sound of tank engines. What happened instead became Morrison's first revelation. The German tanks had rolled forward at 0600 hours in classic Panzer formation, tanks forward with infantry half-tracks, following at 400 meters. American forward positions, manned by elements of the 18th Infantry Regiment, had spotted them immediately. The sun was just rising behind the American positions, silhouetting the German armor against the pale morning sky. It was perfect shooting light. Morrison spoke with Lieutenant Thomas Harker, 26 years old, from Ohio, who had commanded one of the forward anti-tank positions. We saw them coming from about 2,000 yards, Harker said, his voice still carrying the edge of adrenaline 3 days later. 50 tanks. I counted them twice to be sure. They were moving fast, maybe 15 miles per hour, in that classic German wedge formation. I remember thinking, this is it. This is Kasserine all over again. My gun sergeant, Sergeant Mike Delacroix from Louisiana, he was a pre-war regular, 12 years in the Army. He looked at me and said, "Sir, we're in the perfect spot. They're going to drive right into us." And I thought he was crazy. 50 tanks, and we had 2 guns. The forward American positions were deliberately light, a standard defensive technique. 2 anti-tank guns, well camouflaged, supported by a company of infantry in foxholes. Behind them, approximately 800 yards back, lay a minefield, hastily planted over the previous 48 hours. Behind the minefield, the main American defensive line. More anti-tank guns, artillery positioned for direct fire over open sights, and the 1st Infantry Division's new tank destroyer battalion, equipped with M10 tank destroyers mounting 3-inch guns. The German tanks overran Harker's position in less than 10 minutes. They just rolled over us, Harker recalled. We got off maybe 6 shots, claimed 1 tank damaged, and then we were running. I lost both guns. The infantry scattered, It looked like a complete disaster. The Germans were through the front line, and we hadn't even slowed them down. But slowing them down had never been the point of the forward positions. As Morrison traced the battle's progress through witness statements and ammunition logs, he began to understand that what looked like a rout was actually something else entirely. Captain James Wheeler, the 1st Division's assistant artillery officer, was 34 years old. From Texas, another product of officer candidate school. He had been coordinating artillery fire from a command post dug into a hillside 1,200 yards behind the front line. "I watched our forward positions get overrun," Wheeler told Morrison. "I saw our boys running. For about 30 seconds, I thought we were beaten. Then I looked at the German tanks and realized they were slowing down. The lead tanks were weaving, trying to find gaps in the minefield. They were bunching up, and I thought, my God, they're perfect targets." Wheeler had 8 artillery batteries under his direct control, roughly 48 guns total, a mix of 75mm and 105mm howitzers. At 0615 hours, he gave the order for all batteries to commence firing for effect on pre-registered defensive targets. "We'd spent the previous 2 days plotting likely German approach routes," Wheeler explained. "We had 12 separate defensive fire missions already computed, with range cards for every battery. When the Germans hit the minefield, they were sitting exactly on target reference point 7. I just called fire mission. Target reference 7, all batteries, fire for effect. Within 90 seconds, we had shells landing." Morrison examined the fire logs from all 8 batteries. Between 0615 and 0900 hours, they recorded 2,947 rounds fired. The logs showed mission numbers, target coordinates, round counts per gun. The pattern was unmistakable. Controlled, coordinated fire maintained for nearly 3 hours. Battery commanders reported back with effects. Tanks observed burning, 2 confirmed. Direct hit on half-track, secondary explosion. Enemy infantry dismounting under fire, scattering. Sergeant Robert Hayes, a forward observer from Minnesota, 28 years old, had been positioned in a shell crater 600 yards from the minefield. He had survived the initial German breakthrough by lying flat in the crater as tanks rumbled past. When artillery fire began, he was perfectly positioned to observe effects and call corrections. "I've never seen anything like it," Hayes said, his hand still shaking slightly when Morrison interviewed him. The shells started landing right in the middle of their formation. The Germans were trying to navigate through the minefield, so they were moving slow, maybe 3 or 4 miles per hour. The artillery just walked back and forth across them. I'd call a correction right 50 yards, and I'd see the next salvo adjust. Tanks were getting hit. Half-tracks were burning. The infantry was trying to deploy, but they were taking casualties before they could even get organized. After about 20 minutes of this, I saw tanks starting to reverse course. They were backing up. By 0800 hours, they were in full retreat. But the artillery was only part of the story. As Morrison pieced together the battle, he discovered that the anti-tank guns and tank destroyers had been equally effective. The American defensive plan had placed anti-tank weapons behind the minefield, protected by berms and positioned for enfilade fire, meaning they could shoot into the flanks of German tanks struggling through the obstacles. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, 41 years old, a pre-war regular from Virginia who commanded the tank destroyer battalion, had positioned his M10s in hull-down positions where only their guns and upper hulls were visible. "The Germans never saw us until we started shooting," Webb told Morrison. Their tanks were focused on the minefield and the artillery fire. They were buttoned up, hatches closed, because of the shell fragments. When we opened fire at around 0630, We were shooting into their flanks at ranges of 400 to 800 yards. At that range, with a 3-inch gun, we could penetrate any German tank in existence. We just picked them off methodically. Engage, fire, confirm hit, shift to next target. My battalion fired 203 rounds over the next hour. We claimed 24 confirmed kills and probably more damaged. Morrison found the wreckage where Webb's battalion had been shooting. Tank after tank showed the distinctive hole of a 3-inch armor-piercing round punched through the side armor. The penetrations were clean, professional, exactly where doctrine said to aim, just below the turret ring or into the engine compartment. These weren't lucky hits. These were trained gunners executing proper firing procedures under combat conditions. The second revelation came when Morrison discovered how quickly the Germans had tried again, and how thoroughly they had been repulsed a second time. At 16:45 hours on March 23rd, German forces launched a renewed assault. They had reorganized, replaced some losses with reserves, and attacked from a slightly different angle. Morrison found the after-action reports documenting this second attack. The Germans came forward with approximately 35 tanks, supported by fresh infantry and heavy artillery preparation. The American defense responded exactly as it had in the morning. Artillery batteries, now fully coordinated and with updated target plots, opened fire within 60 seconds of the first German movement. Anti-tank guns, repositioned during the midday lull, engaged at maximum effective range. Tank destroyers, having learned the German approach routes, were positioned for even better fields of fire. Corporal David Simmons, 24 years old from Michigan, was a gunner on a 75mm anti-tank gun. The second time they came at us, we knew what to expect, Simmons said. We'd spent the afternoon improving our position, stacking sandbags, camouflaging better. When they appeared, I ranged them at 1,400 yards. Too far for a good shot. We waited. My lieutenant, Lieutenant Anderson, he kept saying, "Steady, steady, let them come." At 900 yards, we fired. First round was a clean miss, right over the target. Second round hit the glacis plate, bounced off. That was a Mark IV, good frontal armor. Third round, I aimed lower, hit the track. Tank stopped. Crew bailed out. We shifted to the next target. By the time that attack petered out around 1800 hours, our gun alone had claimed 4 kills and 2 probables. The German assault lasted less than 2 hours. By 1800 hours, German forces were withdrawing again, having gained no ground and suffered additional casualties. Morrison tallied the losses. The Germans had committed roughly 85 tanks to 2 attacks and lost or had disabled at least 45 of them, perhaps more, a loss rate exceeding 50%. For a German armored division, this was catastrophic. That night, March 23rd to 24th, German and Italian forces consolidated on the hills east of El Guetar. They would make no more major attacks. The tactical initiative had shifted completely to the Americans. The third revelation was the most psychologically difficult for Morrison to process. The Americans had done this while still learning, while still making mistakes, while still far from perfect. Over the following week, Morrison interviewed dozens of soldiers and officers. Their accounts revealed a force that was not exceptional, not suddenly transformed into supermen, but rather finally executing basic doctrine competently. Captain Richard Sullivan, operations officer for the 18th Infantry Regiment, 38 years old from Massachusetts, put it bluntly. We didn't become great soldiers overnight. We're still making plenty of mistakes. But at El Guetar, we did the simple things right. We prepared defensive positions properly. We coordinated supporting fires. We maintained communications. We held our ground when it mattered. These are basics. Kasserine taught us the cost of not doing basics. El Guetar showed we'd learned the lesson. Morrison found evidence of continued American shortcomings throughout the battle records. Communications frequently broke down, forcing runners to carry messages on foot. Artillery fire missions were sometimes delayed by confusion over coordinates. Infantry units showed poor small unit tactics in several engagements. Supply distribution was chaotic at times. The list of problems was long, but the Germans hadn't won. That was the revelation Morrison struggled to reconcile. American forces, still plagued with coordination problems, still learning basic skills, still led by inexperienced officers, had stopped cold one of Germany's elite armored divisions. How was this possible? The answer emerged slowly as Morrison compiled his report. American forces at El Guetar had possessed three advantages that offset their inexperience. First, exceptional artillery in quantity and quality. The 1st Infantry Division's artillery battalions had more guns, more ammunition, and better fire direction equipment than equivalent German units. When properly employed, which they finally were at El Guetar, this firepower was devastating. Second, superior anti-tank weapons. The new 75mm anti-tank gun and the M10 tank destroyer both mounted guns capable of defeating any German armor at combat ranges. American doctrine emphasized anti-tank defense in depth. Multiple layers of weapons designed to channel and destroy armored attacks. At El Guetar, for the first time, American forces had executed this doctrine correctly. Third, and perhaps most important, American soldiers had learned that they could win. The psychological transformation from Kasserine to El Guetar was profound. Sergeant William Martinez, 30 years old from New Mexico, a squad leader in the 1st Infantry Division, captured this shift. After Kasserine, we knew the Germans could beat us. We'd seen it happen. At El Guetar, when those panzers came rolling toward us, every man was scared. But we'd prepared our positions. We had good fields of fire. We had orders that made sense. And when the shooting started, we didn't run. We stayed and fought. After they withdrew that first time, after we saw all those burning tanks, something changed. We looked at each other and thought, we can do this. We can beat these guys. That changes everything. As the days following the initial battle unfolded, Morrison documented a grinding struggle that revealed both the limits and the potential of American forces. From March 30th through April 3rd, American forces attempted to advance, attacking Italian-held positions on Hill 369. The 1st Infantry Division and 9th Infantry Division, supported by elements of the 1st Armored Division, launched repeated assaults. These attacks showed all the problems that still plagued American forces. Coordination between infantry and armor was poor. Artillery support was sometimes excellent, sometimes absent. Infantry units attacked without adequate reconnaissance. Several attacks were repulsed with heavy casualties. Lieutenant Paul Jackson, 25 years old from Oregon, led a platoon in one of the assaults on Hill 369. It was a nightmare, Jackson said flatly. We attacked uphill against prepared positions. The Italians had machine guns positioned perfectly. We had artillery support for about 15 minutes. Then it lifted, and we were supposed to assault. We got halfway up the slope, and the machine guns opened up. We took 50% casualties in 10 minutes. I pulled my platoon back. We tried again the next day with better planning, still couldn't take the position. Yet on April 3rd, after 4 days of costly attacks, Hill 369 fell to American forces. Morrison examined the after-action reports, trying to understand what had changed. The answer was persistence, combined with tactical adaptation. Each failed attack had revealed Italian defensive positions. American artillery gradually destroyed Italian strongpoints. Ammunition supplies for the defenders dwindled. Casualties mounted. When the final American assault went in on April 3rd, Italian resistance collapsed not from American tactical brilliance, but from cumulative attrition. Morrison interviewed Major Anthony Russo, an Italian officer captured when Hill 369 fell. Russo was 34 years old, from Sicily, a professional soldier with service in Ethiopia and Libya. "Your army learns fast," Russo told Morrison through an interpreter. The first attacks were badly coordinated, easy to defeat. But each attack was slightly better. Your artillery fire became more accurate. Your infantry used better approaches. By the third day, we were low on ammunition. Our positions were damaged. Our casualties were mounting. We could not hold. If you had attacked like that first assault all 4 days, we would still be holding the hill. But you learned. You adapted. That is the difference. The battle for Hill 772 demonstrated the same pattern. 9th Infantry Division initially attacked on March 30th and was repulsed. The division regrouped, received additional artillery support, and prepared a more deliberate assault. But before the attack could be renewed, German reinforcements arrived. The 21st Panzer Division, another elite formation. With German armor on Hill 772, the American advance stalled completely. Neither side could gain advantage. The battle settled into stalemate. The transformation Morrison was documenting was not a sudden leap to excellence, but rather the beginning of institutional learning. He compiled statistics that showed the trend. At Kasserine Pass in mid-February, American forces had suffered approximately 6,000 casualties and inflicted perhaps 2,000 on German forces. A casualty ratio heavily favoring the Germans. At El Guetar, American casualties for the March 23rd defense totaled approximately 300 killed and wounded. German and Italian casualties exceeded 1,000, plus at least 45 tanks destroyed. The casualty ratio had reversed, but the statistics from the attacks on Hills 369 and 772 told a more sobering story. American casualties in those assaults exceeded 1,000. Italian casualties were probably comparable. The Americans had eventually taken Hill 369 through persistence and firepower superiority, not tactical skill. Hill 772 remained in Axis hands. American offensive capabilities were still developing. Morrison's analysis revealed an army in transition. Defensive capabilities had improved dramatically from Kasserine to El Guetar. The ability to hold prepared positions, coordinate supporting fires, and employ anti-tank weapons effectively was now approaching acceptable standards. But offensive capabilities, the ability to attack prepared positions successfully, to coordinate complex combined arms assaults, to maintain momentum in the face of resistance, these remained weak. Colonel William Patterson, the 1st Infantry Division's Chief of Staff, 45 years old from Pennsylvania, a professional soldier with 20 years of service, reviewed Morrison's preliminary report. "This is good analysis," Patterson told him. "We've learned to defend. We still have a lot to learn about attacking. But here's what matters. We held our ground against the 10th Panzer Division. Every soldier in this division knows that now. Every soldier in every American division will hear about it. We proved we can stand and fight. That's the foundation. Everything else builds from there." The final revelation came on April 7th, when British forces advancing from the southeast linked up with American forces on the El Guetar-Gabes Road. Morrison was present when the 1st British units, elements of the 50th Infantry Division, made contact with American patrols at approximately 1700 hours. The British commander, a major whose name Morrison recorded as Edwin Thornhill, age 38, from Yorkshire, stepped out of his scout car and shook hands with the American patrol leader. "Well done, holding this position," Thornhill said, his tone professionally neutral. "We'd heard you had the 10th Panzer here. Expected to find you'd withdrawn." The American patrol leader, Lieutenant Samuel Brennan, 27 years old from New York, smiled tightly. "We sent them packing on March 23rd. They haven't tried again." Thornhill's expression shifted from polite professionalism to genuine surprise. "You stopped a 10th Panzer assault? In open terrain?" "Killed about 30 of their tanks in the first attack. Another 15 or so in their second try. They've been sitting on those hills ever since." Morrison watched Thornhill process this information. The British officer walked to the edge of the road and surveyed the terrain, looking east toward the hills where German and Italian forces remained dug in. "How many tanks did you lose?" "3. 2 damaged, recovered, and repaired. 1 total loss." "3. Thornhill turned back to Brennan, his skepticism visible. "You're quite sure?" "I can show you the battlefield, sir. German wrecks are still out there. Ours are already back in the maintenance depot." Morrison introduced himself, showed his credentials, and offered to brief Thornhill on the March 23rd battle. Over the next hour, as British and American forces established a formal link-up point, Morrison walked Thornhill through the engagement. They examined destroyed German tanks. Morrison shared his battle analysis, showing artillery logs, anti-tank gun reports, and casualty figures. Thornhill's assessment changed visibly as he reviewed the evidence. "This is not what I expected," he admitted finally. "Our intelligence assessment suggested American forces were still recovering from Kasserine, that you'd need several more months of rebuilding before facing German armor effectively. This," he gestured at the destroyed tanks, "suggests those assessments require revision." "What we learned at Kasserine cost us badly," Morrison said. "But we learned. The troops at El Guetars were the same troops that got beaten at Kasserine. Same division, mostly the same battalions. But they fought differently, because they prepared differently, and they believed differently." Thornhill nodded slowly. "Belief is half the battle in war. If your soldiers believe they can win, they often will. If they believe they'll lose, they certainly will. Kasserine taught your men they could lose. El Guetar taught them they could win. That changes the entire calculation." Morrison completed his formal report on April 12, 1943. The document ran to 47 pages, including detailed appendices with casualty figures, ammunition expenditure data, unit deployments, and tactical diagrams. He summarized the battle's significance in his opening assessment. The engagement at El Guetar, 23 March to 7 April 1943, represents a turning point in American combat effectiveness in the North African theater. For the first time, American forces successfully defended against a major German armored assault, inflicting heavy casualties while sustaining relatively light losses themselves. This success demonstrates that American troops, when properly prepared, adequately supplied, and competently led, can perform effectively against experienced German forces. Morrison's conclusion was more personal. The soldiers who held El Guetar are not fundamentally different from the soldiers who fled at Kasserine Pass. Many are the same individuals. What changed was not the quality of personnel, but the application of sound defensive doctrine, the employment of superior firepower, and most critically, the psychological state of the troops themselves. Having learned through bitter experience what happens when doctrine is ignored and Preparations are inadequate. These soldiers executed basic military fundamentals competently. The result was a significant tactical victory. He included a statistical appendix that would be referenced in military staff colleges for decades afterward. German forces committed 85 tanks to 2 attacks on March 23rd. American forces destroyed or disabled at least 45 of them, possibly as many as 52, while losing 3 of their own. German casualties exceeded 1,000 killed, wounded, and captured. American casualties for the defense totaled 312. The casualty ratio, approximately 3 to 1 in American favor, was unprecedented for an engagement between German and American forces up to that date. But Morrison's most important observation appeared in a section on lessons learned. The El Guettar engagement demonstrates that American forces can achieve tactical success against German forces when 3 conditions are met. First, American forces must be allowed to fight from prepared defensive positions where their superior firepower can be optimally employed. Second, American forces must have adequate time to coordinate supporting fires and establish proper communications. Third, and perhaps most important, American forces must believe in their ability to succeed. The psychological transformation from Kasserine to El Guettar was as important as any material or tactical improvement. The broader pattern that El Guettar illustrated was transforming the entire Allied strategy in the Mediterranean. Morrison's report circulated through 2 Corps headquarters, then to Allied Forces headquarters in Algiers. Copies reached Washington within 2 weeks. The statistical evidence was undeniable. American forces had proven capable of stopping German armor. This capability opened new strategic possibilities. Allied planners had assumed American forces would need to be paired with British units for any major offensive operations, that Americans would play a supporting role while British forces conducted the decisive operations. El Guettar suggested this assumption was overly pessimistic. If Americans could defend successfully against German attacks, they might be capable of more independent operations than previously believed. The immediate strategic impact was limited. The Tunisia campaign was already reaching its conclusion. Axis forces were being compressed into a shrinking perimeter. The Battle of El Guettar contributed to this compression, but did not dramatically alter the campaign's timeline. But the longer-term implications were profound. American military planners were designing operations for Sicily, Italy, and eventually northwestern Europe. Every one of these plans depended on assumptions about American combat effectiveness. How many American divisions would be needed to achieve specific objectives? How well would American forces perform against German opposition? Could Americans conduct independent operations, or would they require constant British support and supervision? El Guettar provided the first solid evidence base for answering these questions. American infantry divisions, properly equipped and adequately trained, could hold ground against German forces. American artillery was effective. American anti-tank defenses could stop German armor. These capabilities were not exceptional, not war-winning on their own, but they were adequate. And adequate performance by dozens of American divisions translated into strategic capability. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, received a briefing on El Guettar in late April. According to notes taken by his aide, Eisenhower commented, "This confirms what I've been arguing. Our troops are not naturally inferior to German troops. They're inexperienced, which is different. Experience can be gained. We've lost battles because we've made mistakes, not because our soldiers can't fight. El Guettar shows what happens when we prepare properly and fight smart. We can build on this." The psychological transformation extended far beyond the 1st Infantry Division. Word of the El Guetar victory spread through American forces in North Africa within days. Soldiers who had not participated in the battle heard detailed accounts from those who had. The story was repeated, embellished, passed along through the informal communication networks that connect frontline troops. The core facts remained consistent. Americans had faced German panzers and won decisively. Private First Class Joseph Romano, 22 years old, from New Jersey, was serving in the 34th Infantry Division, a unit that had not been engaged at El Guetar. "We heard about it maybe 3 days after the battle," Romano said. "The guys from the 1st Division were talking it up. 50 German tanks destroyed. The 10th Panzer Division sent packing. At first, we thought they were exaggerating. You know how soldiers talk. But then we started seeing official reports, unit citations, captured German equipment being brought back. It was true, and it changed how we felt. Up until then, there was always this sense that maybe we couldn't beat the Germans in a straight-up fight. Kasserine had really shaken everyone, but El Guetar showed it could be done. Not easily, not without cost, but it could be done. That mattered to every American soldier in North Africa. The transformation was institutional as much as psychological. American commanders began writing new tactical doctrines based on El Guetar's lessons. The emphasis on anti-tank defense in depth was reinforced. Artillery doctrine was revised to stress pre-planned defensive fires and rapid response to breakthrough attempts. Infantry training stressed the importance of holding positions even when initially overrun, trusting that supporting fires and reserves would restore the situation. Training programs in the United States incorporated El Guetar into their curriculum. New divisions preparing for deployment studied the battle as an example of proper defensive techniques. The tactical decisions that had led to victory at El Guetar became standard operating procedure across the expanding American army. Morrison himself experienced the psychological transformation he was documenting in others. On the morning of March 24th, walking among the destroyed German tanks, he had felt a curious mixture of disbelief and vindication. Disbelief because the evidence before him contradicted everything he thought he knew about American military capability. Vindication because the evidence proved that with proper preparation and execution, American forces could succeed. In his private journal, which Morrison kept throughout the war, he wrote on March 25th, "I have spent 4 months documenting American failures. I have filed reports detailing our shortcomings, our mistakes, our defeats. Some of those reports were painful to write because they described the deaths of men I knew, the destruction of units I respected. I wrote them because accurate reporting is essential, even when it reflects poorly on our capabilities. Now I find myself in the strange position of documenting a success. The wreckage in the valley below El Guetar is proof that we can fight effectively. The casualty figures demonstrate that we can win at acceptable cost. Yet I find myself more cautious in writing this report than I was in writing about our failures. Success can be more dangerous than failure if it leads to overconfidence. The truth is that we won at El Guetar because we prepared well. We employed our advantages effectively, and we finally executed doctrine competently. These are not exceptional achievements. They are the baseline of military competence. We should not celebrate reaching the baseline as if it were the pinnacle. But we should recognize that reaching the baseline is the necessary first step toward excellence." Morrison would go on to serve throughout the war, participating in the Sicily invasion, the Italian campaign, and eventually the Normandy invasion. He would write dozens more intelligence assessments, tactical analyses, and after-action reports. But his El Guetar report remained the one he considered most significant. It documented the moment, he wrote years later, when we stopped believing we were inferior and started believing we could compete. Everything else followed from that psychological shift. The final irony emerged years after the war, when German records became available for analysis. Morrison, by then a professor of military history, examined German 10th Panzer Division records in 1951 while researching a book on the Tunisia campaign. The German assessment of the March 23rd attack was remarkably similar to Morrison's contemporary analysis, but with an additional element that Morrison had not fully appreciated during the battle itself. The German division, Commander General Fischer had written in his after-action report, "The attack on 23 March against American positions at El Guetar was conducted according to established doctrine and with reasonable expectation of success based on American performance at Kasserine Pass. The result was catastrophic. American artillery fire was far heavier and better coordinated than intelligence estimates suggested possible. American anti-tank defenses were positioned in depth and employed with unexpected skill. American troops did not panic or withdraw under pressure, as previous experience suggested they would. Casualties were severe. Division combat effectiveness is significantly reduced. Recommend no further offensive operations against prepared American positions without substantial reinforcement." What struck Morrison most about this German assessment was its date. Fischer had written it on March 24th, the same day Morrison had walked the battlefield. While Morrison had been struggling to understand how Americans had achieved such success, Fischer had been struggling to understand how Germans had suffered such failure. Both officers were documenting the same transformation from opposite perspectives. Fischer's report continued with a strategic assessment that Morrison found particularly striking. The American Army in North Africa appears to be improving rapidly. Early defeats at Kasserine and other engagements suggested American forces were not capable of effective resistance against German units. This assessment requires revision. American material advantages in artillery and anti-tank weapons are significant. American defensive doctrine, when properly executed, is sound. Most significantly, American troops appear to have learned from early defeats and are now fighting with greater confidence and skill. If this trend continues, American forces will become increasingly difficult to defeat in coming months. Fischer's analysis proved prophetically accurate. The American army that landed in Sicily 3 months after El Guetar was markedly more effective than the army that had been routed at Kasserine. The improvement continued through Italy and culminated in the Normandy invasion, where American forces played a co-equal role with British and Canadian forces in liberating Western Europe. Morrison returned to El Guetar in 1963, 20 years after the battle. He was 67 years old, long retired from both the army and academic life, traveling through Tunisia on what he called a nostalgia tour. The battlefield had changed remarkably little. The hills overlooking the town were the same. The valley where German tanks had burned was now farmland, but the contours were unchanged. Some of the destroyed tank hulks remained, too damaged to salvage, gradually rusting into the landscape. He walked the defensive positions where American artillery had been positioned in March 1943. The gun pits were still visible, partially collapsed, but unmistakable. He traced the probable route of the German attack, trying to imagine what Lieutenant Harker had seen from his forward anti-tank position, what Captain Wheeler had observed from the artillery command post, what Sergeant Hayes had witnessed from his shell crater. A Tunisian farmer, working nearby fields, approached and struck up a conversation. The farmer spoke some English, learned during the war years. "You were here during the fighting?" he asked. "Yes. I came here the day after the big battle in March 1943. Ah, the tank battle. My father saw it. He was a boy, watching from the hills. He said it was like thunder, continuous, for hours. The American guns, they never stopped firing. The German tanks, they burned. He said after the battle, American soldiers walked among the wrecks, looking at what they had done, and they seemed surprised, as if they had not expected to win so completely. Morrison smiled at that description. We were surprised. We had lost badly just a month before. We didn't know if we could win against German tanks. When we did win, it changed everything. My father said the Americans were different after that battle. Before, they seemed uncertain, like they were not sure they belonged here, fighting this war. After, they seemed like they knew what they were doing, like they believed they would win. Your father was perceptive. That's exactly what changed. We learned we could fight effectively. Once we learned that, we were a different army. Morrison stood quietly for several minutes, looking across the valley where 30 German tanks had burned 20 years earlier. He thought about the men who had fought here, some of whom he had interviewed in the days following the battle. Some had survived the war and returned to civilian life. Others had died in Sicily, Italy, France, or Germany. The battle itself had faded from public memory, overshadowed by larger, more famous engagements. But for the men who fought at El Guetar, and for Morrison himself, it remained significant. The lesson Morrison drew from El Guetar extended far beyond military tactics or historical documentation. We learn who we are through testing, he wrote in his book's conclusion. The 1st Infantry Division believed it was inexperienced and inferior to German forces because it had been tested at Kasserine Pass and found wanting. That belief shaped behavior, making success less likely in future engagements. But at El Guetar, through a combination of better preparation, favorable circumstances, and sheer determination, the same division proved it could succeed. That success reshaped belief, which reshaped behavior, which increased the probability of future success. The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. We learned not just that we could win, but that our previous defeats did not define our capabilities. Failure had been a temporary condition, not a permanent state. This lesson, applicable far beyond military affairs, is perhaps the most significant legacy of the Battle of El Guetar. The 30 German tank hulks scattered across the valley on March 24, 1943, which seemed to Captain Robert Morrison like evidence of an isolated tactical victory, actually represented something far more significant. The moment when American forces learned they could compete with the best armies in the world. Everything that followed, the victories in Sicily and Italy, the successful Normandy invasion, the drive across France and into Germany, all built on the psychological foundation established at El Guetar. The belief that victory was possible became the precondition for achieving victory. History remembers the great battles, the famous victories, the decisive turning points. El Guetar's was none of these. But it was the battle where Americans learned they could win, where inexperienced troops discovered they could stand against veterans, where a defeated army found the confidence to keep fighting. In the architecture of Allied victory in World War II, El Guetar was a foundation stone, invisible in the finished structure, but essential to everything built upon it. The 30 burning panzers told that story to anyone who knew how to read it. Morrison had learned to read it on March 24, 1943. Walking among the wreckage in the early morning light, his hands trembling as he counted the destroyed tanks and understood, finally, what they meant. Not that Americans had become great soldiers overnight, but that they had learned the most important lesson any army can learn: that defeat is temporary, that improvement is possible, and that belief in victory is halfway to achieving it.